Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review, and in this video I'm going to review Optical Delusion by Orbital. I'm really happy that I'm finally able to talk about one of my favorite electronic duos of all time, Orbital. The duo of Paul and Phil Hartnoll have done some amazing albums in terms of techno, progressive breaks and IDM, and in general I'd say that Orbital have one of my favorite and one of the most consistent catalogs I've heard of all time. The previous album that they did almost 5 years ago at this point, Masters Exist, is possibly my least favorite work out of them. It was one that slightly disappointed me, however I wouldn't necessarily say that I disliked the album, instead I would actually say that this is another album that I enjoyed quite a lot. However, it went into some familiar directions when it comes to the more wacky and silly aesthetics that we somewhat get from certain Orbital tracks, but I believe it was to that extent where it wasn't executed necessarily all that much amazingly. I still really like this album, but it's certainly not one of my favorites when it comes to the overall Orbital catalog. So getting into Optical Delusion after all of those years, I was hoping for something kinda different, something that would go into something different and more refreshing directions from Orbital, and I believe that in a sense we certainly have that. This is an album that feels kinda different when it comes to its overall aesthetics, and it's a pretty varied work. However, I'd say it's one that goes kinda closer to what Orbital did with Wonky, especially with the way they've handled all of those different features, how much of a varied album it is in terms of its styles, though in this one obviously we don't get the directions of Wonky. However, when it comes to the techno and the breaks elements, I believe that we get some pretty similar stuff and a sound that is quite familiar for Orbital fans, like you know that you're getting into an Orbital album while listening to this one. And what's also really great about this band is that this is another case of an album where it took me a couple of listens to really appreciate everything that it has going on for it. When it comes to the vast majority of Orbital releases, they always manage to create tracks that make me wanna come back to them. I still enjoyed the album upon the first listen, but it made me wanna come back to it more and more, thinking that there is even more to appreciate about it, that there is much more going on to it. And gladly this is another case of an Orbital album that is a huge grower on me, and the more I listen to it, the more I end up appreciating what it was going for. With the very first track, I believe that we get a pretty solid introduction with Ringa Ringa, the old pandemic folk song featuring the Mediaeval Baebes. This is a sound that right from the beginning it feels pretty familiar. It is kinda standard for what you would expect out of Orbital, and in my opinion once again it works in a really good way over here. It makes for a really fun and enjoyable song, one that is really catchy, it has some really solid beats to it, and overall I like the huge variety of sounds that there is to this song and how it progresses and manages to have a really nice blend of many different sounds coming together, from really solid beats to really beautiful synths, some very cool atmospheric female vocals that are done and delivered in a way that goes into directions that you would expect from an Orbital song, and overall it's a really nice way to start the album. It is kinda fun and cheerful and enjoyable, and it's a really good, catchy and energetic theme. We keep up with the highlights with the very next song, Day One, featuring Dina, Ipavic. This one feels kinda similar in terms of its rhythmic sections and the way it handles its female vocals. Apart from that, it has a bit of a different vibe to it, as it feels a kinda more dark and more energetic song, but it still makes for another really solid moment out of this album, a track that is really catchy and enjoyable, and it's also another case of a song where you have many different sounds blending together and making for an outstanding mix, something that I really like when it comes to Orbital songs. The only instance where I could feel that this track could have been handled in a bit of a different way is when it comes to the bass response, as I would prefer the focus of the bass to not be centered around this monotone kick, but rather as an additional bass portion on this main melody, which in my opinion would make for an even more impactful and better experience. But even with what we have over here, this is a track that is handled in a really nice way with a really great collection of sounds. With the third track though is where the album started to kinda lose me, with Are You Alive featuring Penelope. It is at this point where I was actually kinda disappointed with the direction that this track was going for. Now this is a moment over here that is more low key, more chill, and I don't necessarily have an issue with that. I believe that Orbital have managed over the years to make tracks that are not as energetic but still manage to sound pretty cool, but I really didn't find anything all that much interesting about the directions of this particular song. It is one that in my opinion it didn't really do that much with the female vocals, the beat was kinda uninteresting, it felt lackluster at certain points. It is a track that is well produced and there are some interesting developments here and there, but it's also a track that in my opinion has slightly poor pacing, which is shockingly surprising, especially when it comes to Orbital stuff, since for me Orbital are some of the best when it comes to some really well paced tracks. But in the case of this one we have an almost 8-minute track over here that in my opinion didn't really need to be that long. The final minutes out of this song feels like an unnecessary instrumental version that could have been easily cut off. It doesn't really add that much to the song, it just makes the experience last longer and I don't really see the reason why. So yeah, for me this was a slightly disappointing track and one that in my opinion wasn't handled in that much of a great way. The next track, You Are the Frequency featuring the Lil Pest, it's a bit of an interesting one as it starts with those wacky vocal samples, which I'd say it's the most memorable thing about this particular song. As it goes on and introduces the other sounds, it has a bit of a more dark and sinister beat than what I would expect out of a track like this, so it makes for a bit of a disconnect with the samples and the way this track is handled in terms of its mood and its aesthetics with the beat and the synth sections. So I find this to be an interesting song overall, but certainly not one of my favorites and one of the more forgettable moments over here. The New Abnormal is a track that has the more wacky and silly approach that we see from Orbital from time to time, though it's a track that goes a bit closer to some of the directions that I didn't really feel were that much strong with their previous album Monsters Exist. And while it has a bit of a change up towards the second half with a more hard-hitting break, it still didn't really do all that much for me. It wasn't one of my favorite ideas over here and it was certainly one of the more forgettable moments out of this album. With Home featuring Gonna Be Savage is where I feel that the album kinda picks up again, and having one of the more soothing, chill and low-key moments out of the album being handled in a better way in comparison to, for example, what we got with Are You Alive. This is one that I'd say it has a really interesting main melody. It's actually one of the most memorable and one of the better ones when it comes to this album. And also I'd say it's one of my favorites when it comes to the female vocal directions. Those soulful vocals really add up to the experience and it makes for a really interesting blend of sounds overall. Though I'd say it's not one of my favorites when it comes to the pacing, as when it abandons the main melody and it goes to those more monotone sections, I believe that they don't really add up that much to the experience. It's just a waste of space, and so for me the track would have possibly been a bit better if it was a bit more straightforward and a bit shorter. But with that being said, this is still a pretty intriguing moment out of this album. But where the album really picks up is with the very next track, Dirty Rat featuring Sleaford Mods. This right here for me is an absolutely spectacular song, and if I would listen to it back when it was released in 2022, it would have easily been in my top 5 spot for the best songs of 2022. That's how much I like this song. I believe that Orbital brings some of their best elements over here. It is heavily energetic and powerful and it has the signature sound of Orbital. It really sounds like an Orbital song, really well fleshed out with incredible beats, incredible synths and an overall outstanding composition. And I wasn't that much familiar with Sleaford Mods, but I believe that this wacky, offbeat, spoken word delivery works outstandingly well for this particular song. And undoubtedly one of my favorite Orbital songs when it comes to pacing and structure, which says a lot considering that for me Orbital are masters when it comes to pacing, but in this one every single moment manages to shine. The chorus out of this is amazing, it elevates the experience even further, it is really powerful, heavily energetic, and as it goes on it also introduces those vocoded parts which sound awesome, the synths are pitched progressively higher. It is just an outstanding experience from start to finish and one of my favorite Orbital songs, period. I've listened to it non-stop and I just love it. I find this to be an outstanding, very well crafted song. The next track, Requiem for the Pre-Apocalypse, melodically, weirdly enough, slightly feels like a continuation from what the previous track did, but we're talking about a completely different direction over here when it comes to sounds, and actually one of the most surprising moments out of this album, as it starts with this really cool sub bass, and then we get those breaks that have this old school drum and bass aesthetic to them, which is certainly something really surprising and made for a quite refreshing moment out of this album. And as it would go on, it would feature some outstanding synth parts, some that would have a bit of a more haunting feel to them, and I really like the direction that this track was going for. However, as the track goes on, it changes its structure into a more simplistic one, and it also adds elements that kind of breaks away from the experience that the track was building up at the beginning. So I believe that after a certain point, the track doesn't really bring some of its strongest elements. It changes the mood, it becomes more vibrant, but I don't really believe that in this particular case it was for the better. It takes away from some of the elements that made the track great in the first place, and it picks up again towards the end by repeating the formula that the track had right at the beginning, but there is this middle portion that in my opinion wasn't as strong enough, so it wasn't a consistently excellent song, and in my opinion it could have been something even better, as we're talking about one of the most refreshing ideas in the album over here. Then we have another track with a little Pest, what a surprise, and this one in my opinion is miles better in comparison to You Are the Frequency. What we get with What a Surprise is the most chaotic moment out of this album. This is a track that is extremely messy, that has many different sounds from heavy bass synths to looped vocals, and it's a pretty chaotic experience. It starts in a more simplistic way, but as the track goes on it really shows its colors, being this really dark, heavy and sinister song with also a trap instrumental, something that I didn't expect, and it makes for another pretty refreshing moment out of this album. But the overall sound choices and combination over here is excellent. The weird spoken word segments that you get from time to time also adds to the experience, making this a really chaotic and really out there song that in my opinion just works really well for what it was going for. Definitely one of the most intriguing moments out of this album. And the final song, Moon Princess featuring Coppe, is possibly my favorite moment over here when it comes to the direction of the female vocals. In this one we get a bit of a more haunting and tribal feel to them, and I like the way some of them are looped with this really simplistic pattern in combination with a beat that works really well. We also get a pretty simplistic beat over here that is pretty fine for what the track does. The highlight of this song though comes towards the second half, where we get this really heavy and bassy pattern that carries on throughout the rest of the song, and it really adds to the experience. It makes the track even darker, and it's such a great addition. Also towards the second half we get another moment with pretty chaotic segments, like with the previous song What a Surprise. There's a lot going on with many different sounds, including spoken word passages, some of them pitched down, and it's just a really intriguing experience overall and a really nice way to end this album. I'm really happy and pleased with the results out of this album. I find this to be an excellent work. It is amazing how after all of those years, Orbital still managed to have such a great and consistent catalog. And despite some really minor shortcomings halfway towards the album, in its majority this is an outstanding work. And it's really nice to see Orbital bringing once again some of the greatest electronic releases for so many decades. I'm gonna give Optical Delusion an 8+ out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why, and what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.